Hello, hello, hello. It's been a little while. Ideally, I'd like to check in at least once a week, but you know, lockdown and earthquakes, children, parenting, neurodivergenting. Did I just coin a new term? Neurodivergenting. Autisticing, PDAing, ADHDing. So, I have been asked to chat a little bit about food. Food, glorious food. This is a really tricky one, isn't it? I've actually taken notes. I never do that. I never, ever take notes. This is what my notes look like. And then usually what would happen is across the day I'll take more notes on top of that, and then I'll sit my coffee cup on top of it and a range of other things, and then the whole book just gets lost. And I know the notes are somewhere, but I've got no idea where. So I'm going to talk a little bit about food and how we can encourage eating and experimenting with food in our family home. The first thing I would say that is the most important is to not demonize food. No vilifying food. And I know that this is really tricky to do because conventionally we've been taught, historically, to consider food as either good or bad, healthy or not healthy. And the risk that we run there is putting ideas into autistic children's little brains that can potentially evolve into very, very dangerous territory in terms of disordered eating, worrying about what we're putting into our bodies, being afraid can become quite a phobia and sometimes branches into OCD and other food disorder. So whilst we ideally want our children to eat a healthy diet, sometimes it's counterproductive to do too much talking around what foods are okay and not okay. Many of us will have children that will not eat anything that we want them to eat, and that's for a range of reasons, but I want to make it very clear they're all very valid and real reasons. So something that might happen is we might have professionals or therapists engage in helping us with our children's eating habits and their diet, and they might say things like, well, they're only expecting ice cream and that's why they're not eating their dinner. Sometimes that's absolutely not true. Sometimes the truth is the ice cream might be the only thing that seems palatable from a sensory perspective. So often our children might gravitate toward plain foods because they are less threatening. If they're smooth and plain and white or all the same colour, if they smell okay, if they feel okay on our skin, then we're going to feel safe with it. So that moves us into how important it is to allow our children to make mess with food. It's so important. And for some of us, if we're neurodivergent adults, it can be really bloody hard. I know for me, I have one child in particular who eats in a very particular way. So an example of that is when I make their favourite breakfast, which is oat and banana pancakes. So she likes to get the pancakes, and instead of just eating them whole, she opens them up and pulls out the centre. For whatever reason, it might be that it's gooey or it's warm or it's soft or it smells fresher, I don't know. She pulls that out, rolls it around in her fingers and then eats it. Now, it took me a really long time to work out she wasn't playing with her food. That's how she eats. Now see, the fine line there is that sometimes we can judge that our children are playing with their food and take it away from them, when actually what they're doing is getting comfortable and safe with their food, experimenting and finding a way that works for them. This is so important, even to the point where sometimes what we might like to do to cultivate an environment of safety with food is we might like to do play incorporating different foods. So some ideas there are that we can get outside with some canvas, or even the back windows if you've got sliding doors. You can get some sauce bottles and paint with tomato sauce, or I think it's called ketchup in the US. Barbecue sauce, you can do that with honey, and it just rinses straight off with a good old hose from the backyard. Another thing is using cream. We might use some cream to do some finger painting, or throw some food colouring in there. Of course, taking into account intolerances and sensitivities and allergies around food, but that's also something I'll touch on in a second. Allowing our children to get messy, to get food on their face, and to not constantly be wiping it up is really important. So what I was saying before is I totally relate to feeling extremely anxious about food being everywhere, and this is a regular occurrence in our home. So it's not uncommon for me to walk through the house after breakfast time and find cornflakes crushed up with hands and thrown on the floor. This is part of the journey of learning to be safe with food. So one of our children likes to eat cornflakes dry with no milk. They'll crush them up in their hands and then eat them, and half of it will spill on the floor, and that has had to be okay in our home. And over time those things will settle down, but I just go in with the vacuum cleaner and clean it up. Sometimes I have to remove myself from a room and pretend it's not happening, and maybe put my headphones on to relieve my own anxiety. So just really paying attention to the fact that when our children are neurodivergent, just for us as neurodivergent people, there are specific ways that we are going to like to eat our food. One of those things is perhaps that we don't like our food touching. I don't have an issue with that personally. Once upon a time, and even now, dependent on what kind of therapies we're engaging with. So if we want to also cultivate positive neurodivergent identity, we are going to make accommodations, and we are going to support our people to do what feels safe and right for them. If we have therapists or therapies that are incorporating goals that include eating in a particular way that is quite aligned with neuronormativity, so eating like everybody else, using a knife and fork, if it's distressing, sometimes it's important to let that stuff go, because for many of us what it comes down to is whether we will eat or not. So many families will have an issue with their child not eating, and there'll be a team of professionals on board, and they're trying every which way to get our children to eat. But the impact of all these well-intentioned interventions can actually feed the fear around food and set up an environment that feels completely threatening and unsafe, which disconnects us from our hunger cues. It interferes with our interoception, which is one of our sensory systems that tells us when we're hungry, when we need to use the bathroom. Because our process of eating, that sensory experience, has been interfered with. I still eat dry cornflakes at 41. Good on you, Adam. I still eat, one of our favourites is Wheat Bix, cut in half with butter and Vegemite, peanut butter spreads on them, and just eating them dry. Love it. My son has always taken the toppings off his pizzas and sandwiches before eating the bread part on its own. Same. My 10-year-old does this. We have food intolerances, so do we. And when he was young, I had to have quite a strict diet in place. Unfortunately, that made us both want to scoff everything we weren't supposed to have, despite the yucky consequences afterwards. Yeah, and this is something I'm going to touch on actually. So yeah, we're going to have different ways that we prefer to have our food. So in our home, for morning and afternoon tea, I create platters. And that means that I just have a cheap $2 container from the reject shop or $2 shop or wherever that allows me to cut up different fruits and veggies and nuts, whatever, and pop it in separate parts of the container and just putting it on the table for the children to help themselves. I don't ever put down a meal and say, it's time to eat your food please. I just put the food there. I yell out to the whole family, dinner time, if that's my role that night, and we just all go to the table. Now, if a child struggles to be at the table, I encourage people to not force them to be there. These things take time, if they happen at all. I think we really do neurodivergent culture and identity a disservice when we look at the behaviour and make assumptions from a non-autistic perspective. So a child that's not sitting at the table to eat, what we might see if we're not autistic is a child that can be trained to sit at the table because they just need to be able to keep still and focus on their food. But let me tell you from an autistic perspective what it's like to sit at a table and eat. Sometimes we may have misophonia, which is another condition where other people's chewing can cause me to rage from the inside. And it's not the person's fault. There's just particular sounds that escalate my anxiety because it's a sensory assault. Misophonia is one example. Sitting at a table means that we are forced to engage several sensory systems at once. For us, this is really difficult to do sometimes, particularly when we're young and we are still growing and developing. Remembering that neurodivergent people, we are on our own timeline of development. So everything takes that little bit longer to come along. Now, if we are mindful of the fact that autistic people, we are quite monotropic, this means that we struggle when we have to focus on more than one thing at a time. If I need to eat my food, that's all I can do right there and then. I can't sit at a table with lots of people as a young autistic child and eat my food comfortably. As a young person, I hated eating in front of others, and when I was at school, I refused to eat lunch because it made me feel so anxious. Now, I'm a PDA autistic, and what that means is that for me, any form of vulnerability that opened me up to criticism or being wrong or doing things the wrong way never felt safe when I was younger. So I would never eat in front of other people. It's important to have conversations that give our children space and comfort to be honest with us around what their challenges are with food. But honestly, forcing our children to sit at the table or making that a goal for our children is not helpful. It really isn't helpful. We just want to sit at the table if we can, get on with what we're doing, relax, have a laugh, be silly. If our children have had enough to eat, that's fine. You know, not making food such a huge deal that adds to the anxiety. Something that is really helpful is paying attention to sensory aspects. So if we notice that our children are sensory aversive or seeking with particular textures, flavors, smells, feels, then we can focus on those things and play to their strengths. So an example of that in our home is, and for me, I really struggle to drink plain water. I will do it, but it's so hard for me to do. It's just so disgusting. So I drink spring water, soda water, mineral water. We have a soda stream and we make our own soda water, and the children will happily guzzle soda water all day long. They don't mind drinking tap water either, but because it's a sensory experience to have the bubbles in the water, instead of having soft drink, we have soda water. Now, for me personally, I had to train myself to do that. Over a number of years, I used to be a Diet Coke fiend, just loved Diet Coke. So I started to water down my Diet Coke just a little bit at a time until it just basically tasted like soda water and there was no point in me drinking Diet Coke anymore. So small steps over time. Also, crunch. If our children love crunch, then we can experiment with different raw veggies like carrots, dipping them in honey. Something we love to eat are celery sticks with peanut butter in the middle and sultanas on top. That's not going to work for every child, because if our children don't like their foods touching, that's not going to happen. But it's about being creative maybe having some sarkatars, some plain rice crackers, and then putting a dip on the side and offering that as an option. Sometimes it's about just having foods to the side, putting their favourite safe foods out, and then having other options to the side with no pressure or expectation. When we talk about children having sensory challenges around food, we're not just talking about the smell of one particular food or the sight of it or how it sounds when it's being cut, because so many of these things aren't things people are aware of. If something sounds gross when it's being cut, it's very unlikely to be eaten by somebody who has that sensory sensitivity. If it sounds weird when it's bubbling in a pot, if it makes crackling sounds in the microwave, all of these things are possibilities for sensory aversions to particular foods. Porridge. I love porridge, but have you ever heard it when it gets stirred around? Oh, misophonia. Oh, it's just so bad. It's so, it's gluggy and it's... So taking into account that there are so many combinations of sensory issues when we're talking about foods, it's important to be mindful that food intolerance can be a very real concern, and it can often be an invisible concern. If you're noticing a particular behaviour following eating a food, it might be worthwhile having some reliable medical testing for issues. But the thing about food intolerance is it can occur, that the response or the reaction to particular foods can occur hours to days after. It's very hard to pin down. Restrictions and limitations, this is a big one, particularly for highly anxious children and PDAs. If we have a child who is demand avoidant, particularly a PDA, any form of restriction or limitation has the potential to set off a frenzied response in the brain to need more and more of what we've put a limit around. This is something that is applied to screens, behaviours. Food is a huge one. Something I see so much is adult PDAs in the cycle of dieting, because what we haven't realised is that those restrictions we place on ourselves are demands, and we are never going to comply. When we tell a PDA that they cannot have something, they cannot have more of it, they can't have this for breakfast because it's not a breakfast food, that's just going to cause this frenzied response to have it. So if somebody said to me, as an example, as a PDA, you cannot have chocolate for dinner, ever. Chocolate is not a dinner food. My neurobiological response is that it's now my mission to demonstrate that chocolate is 100% a dinner food and can also be a lunch food and a breakfast food. Please watch me show you. And I will lose choice in that. So PDAs, when they're asked not to do something or told that they can't do something, they're going to do it. And it won't be a conscious choice. It'll be a neurobiological drive behind that. So when we put in the demonizing of food or the vilifying of food or saying, no, this is not a food that we eat at this time of day, we run the risk of creating, again, those phobias around food. Something I do at home is I try and keep one element of every meal consistent. So that might be salt. I might take some flaky sea salt and just put it on everything, just a little bit. So we might have a fruit and veggie platter, it might be dinner time, it might be porridge, and I will always put just a teeny tiny bit of salt, because that familiar ingredient communicates to the brain that there's something safe about this. There's something safe about this meal. I'm identifying and recognizing a familiar taste. So we are creating familiarity inside of something that is new and unfamiliar. We're also setting up some predictability. It doesn't have to be salt, it could be anything. You might have a sauce bottle sitting next to every single meal. Yeah, it could be having something on the table that's the same every time we eat. It could be that we have a particular song playing in the background every time we eat. It's about communicating to the brain through the sensory systems rather than talking about the food. It's time to eat. You're going to be really hungry if you don't eat. I'm worried about you. You're so thin. All of that escalates the anxiety and sets us up to be even more disconnected from food because it places pressure around the act of eating and meal times. Instead, we set up familiarity and predictability through the sensory systems. We could be burning an oil in the background, or have some kind of candle lit in the background that lets off a particular fragrance at meal times. So the brain catches the smell or the sound or the sight and knows that it's safe. It just really helps to carry us through that eating time when it may not feel so safe. There's so much more around that, but I can't think of anything at the moment. I'm just going to go into the comments. We free range now, after also discovering we all have misophonia, so the pressure is off and the respect for each other. That's great. Free ranging's great. Also being aware that we don't have to have full-on meals either. It's okay to graze. It's okay to have little bits of this and little bits of that. Trial and error. And the development of our palate will always be evolving and changing over time. So there are so many things I wouldn't eat as a child that I love now. Yes, we allow ketchup on everything if it means they eat the veggies and protein. Yeah. Tips on encouraging eating when the child physically can't feel when they are hungry but really needs food to maintain blood sugar and for nutrition. This is me, Sarah. So I'm working with a professional now that's teaching me how to eat across the day. And my mind has been blown. I'm 42 years old and I've raised children. And here I am to tell you that I had a situation where I was getting to the end of the day, most days, experiencing incredible irritability, migraines, just feeling absolutely bombed out by the afternoon, and started working with a professional who specializes in food and eating, and had me fill out a food diary for a week, it was a big ask for me, but I did it. And I learnt very, very quickly. I was having a coffee for breakfast and nothing else until dinner time. And dinner time was I was so disconnected from what I needed that I'd just, have anything and have it all and then go to bed, where my poor body was trying to digest this food overnight. What I learned is that I have poor interoception, that I am not connected with my hunger signals. So for me, being a PDA, any kind of interoception is received by my brain as a demand rather than a signal. So when my tummy rumbles and I need to eat, I feel annoyed and I ignore it. If I feel like I need to use the bathroom, I feel annoyed and I ignore it, and I keep working and pushing through. It's not conscious, I just do it. And so I've had to learn how to have a toolkit to remind myself to do those things like eating. So now I've got it mapped out in my calendar that I eat at particular times, so I'm not ravenous. But I don't refer to it as eating. I call it my wild idling time, which I'm going to credit to my mentor. I'm having a mental blank and can't remember her name, and that's so weird, but it's probably because I need to go and eat. I'll come back to it and pop it in the comments. I call it my wild idling time. It means I take a break and I create something that's going to nourish me, and at the same time I hop into my dreaming. So I allow myself to zone out, to imagine. Sometimes I might draw, listen to something, have a chat. I make it a really enjoyable time for me. So I'm wondering if we could hone in on the foods that they do love and get creative around that, but also incorporate joy into those moments and make that the focus rather than the food. So it might be that we whip a board game out and have some snacks next to the board game, so that there's an unconscious just grabbing as a stim. Sometimes food can be used as a stim for regulation as well. It's very tricky. My daughter's restricted diet caused iron deficiency, which then made her actually more sensitive. Yes, that can happen too. My youngest, who is generally very good with food, has become a little more picky the last few months. Every other day is a drive to Macca's to get a small chips. It actually provides some consistency during lockdown. Kristy, before we had Uber Eats and Menu Log, let me tell you, we had the same order in the drive-through every time. And you know what? We used that. My husband and I used to take it in turns. Who needed to leave the house the most? Who needed the break the most? And it was a joy to sit in that drive-through, especially if you went there on a Friday night and it was totally backed up. Oh, once upon a time I would have cried about that. But when you need a break, when you're a busy parent, more than happy to sit in the drive-through, and we'd get 4 large fries. Just the 4 large fries, sitting in the drive-through for like half an hour, but it was such a good break. Food aversions are what keep me up at night. My son has very limited safe foods. He's in grade 2 and quite social. Our usual friendship group know my son's eating habits and understand, but now with new friendship group forming outside of school, I worry that he'll be pressured to eat or judged. Usually, I'll bring his food to play dates, but I feel like I need to explain and tell the parents of his diagnosis. How would you advise I navigate this in the future? Because telling each parent at each play date doesn't feel right. Hard to get around that, isn't it? See, we are a completely autistic family and we're very big on autistic pride. So for me, it wouldn't be an issue to say we're autistic. We have a certain amount of foods that are safe for us at this point in time, and anything outside of that causes extreme anxiety. So we appreciate being able to stick to these. I think that's okay, to be honest. Yeah. It's something many of us have had to face, I think, as parents and autistic people. Kelly says, "Hey Kelly, ooh, I have lived experience advice, RE the blood sugar drop thing. Offering a lolly or biscuit prior to considering other food, or offering the food to a kid in that irritable state. Absolutely 100%. My sister and I are like that too, Kelly. It gets to the point where it's just too much and you can't think. It gives my brain enough fuel to better sit with and connect with my hunger and satiation cues." Yeah, Brooke, get onto it. Food, it's a thing. Who would have thunk it? Food nourishes the body, keeps us going, fuels us. Can you believe it? Where have I been for 42 years? How would you suggest guiding a child who intentionally spills water repeatedly at the dinner table? I would not force them to sit at the table. I'd look at why they were spilling the water, what was driving that behaviour, and I'm curious about how you know that it's intentional. Those are things that are really important to look at, and if it's about coming to the table and they don't want to, I wouldn't ask them to. Also, let's talk about screens and bringing screens to the table. If that's what helps our children to eat, then it's okay. Every family is going to be different, and it's important to come back and live in the now instead of projecting into the future. Or if my 7-year-old child is eating breakfast with their iPad next to them, are they going to be a 70-year-old adult eating breakfast with an iPad next to them? Really, at the end of the day, does it matter? Does it matter? And why would we want to stress ourselves out with that anyway? Down the line, it's not now. Now is now, and that's all we have. Thanks everyone for being here and for engaging. It's so nice to see everyone and to have the time to come in here. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you again hopefully in a week's time. Bye bye now.